Stop the 1-gram sabotage that freezes every nuclear sub. The coolant alarms hit first, short metallic, then constant. In the control room, someone whispers scram, and the core drops out of the fight. Mid-Pacific, a patrol ends itself. Engineers chase a ghost, sensors, valves, a loose connector, until the chemistry log says what nobody wants to hear. The lithium looks fine on paper, but the isotope math is off by less than a paperclip's worth. 1 gram wrong side of purity. You can't fix that at sea. You can only surface. Command calls it a precaution. The captain calls it what it is, a leash. To see why a gram matters, we need to rewind. The dramatic question and road map. Who holds lithium-7, and how did a paper-thin leak in specs become strategic handcuffs for the most expensive ships we own? That's the knot. We'll pull it from 4 threads. The Cold War pipeline that made LI-7 invisible and essential. The industrial choke points that narrowed to one region. The quiet policy choices that turned caution into dependency. And the modern naval routines lashed to an isotope nobody talks about. Start with what Li-7 actually does. In pressurized water reactors, the kind under a submarine's skin, lithium hydroxide made from Li-7 sets and holds the coolant's pH, roughly the 7.2 to 7.4 equivalent at 300 degrees Celsius. Those numbers aren't housekeeping. They decide whether the primary loop eats its own metal. Get the pH wrong and nickel alloys pit. Corrosion products shed, stress grows in welds. Keep it right and crud stays quiet, fuel cladding breathes within limits, and dose remains manageable. Now the trap. Natural lithium carries 2 stable isotopes, Li-7 and Li-6. Chemically, they look the same. Neutronically, they aren't. Li-6 has a big appetite for neutrons. When it captures one, it splits to helium and tritium. That sounds abstract until you're the watch officer watching tritium monitors creep and hydrogen pick up build where you can't afford it. Every extra Li-6 atom is parasitic absorption that steals margin from the core and turns your coolant into a slow tritium factory. So the Navy drives Li-7 purity to the edge. Think 99.9% and tighter for submarine-grade LiOH. That 1 gram rule is shorthand for the sliver of isotopic slack you actually have in a system that hates surprises. Here where the history boomerangs. The reason we ever had that kind of Li-7 was the bomb. From the 1950s through the 1970s, US plants at Oak Ridge and Savannah River ran chemical exchange cascades, COLEX, the mercury-based process, and caustic soda variants to split lithium by mass. It was dirty, finicky work. Mercury moved the isotopes. People moved the mercury. Oak Ridge carried the cleanup scars into politics, and the know-how aged out with the crews. When weapons needs fell, the columns went quiet. The Navy's requirement didn't. Then the market did what markets do. It consolidated, generalized, and priced for bulk lithium, not isotope purity. Civil buyers could live with looser specs. Defense couldn't. In 2013, the Government Accountability Office published what had been whispered inside programs. The US had no domestic Li-7 production. Nobody in government owned the stewardship problem, and the country was riding foreign suppliers with limited transparency. The report is bland on the surface, ensure a stable future supply, but the subtext is sharp. If your boats depend on grams of assay they can't verify until they're pier side, you don't own your schedule. Meanwhile, procurement culture learned to treat lithium like commodity powder. Certificates showed lithium content, not Li-7 enrichment. Vendors split batches to meet delivery windows, and blending became a habit. On paper, you hit the number. In the core, the neutron penalty stacked up over months. That's how a footnote turns into a leash. So this is the roadmap. We go back to the bomb's quiet ingredient and meet the chemists who kept mercury from eating their instruments while they pushed Li-7 to weapons-era purities. We walk through the switch off, when decommissioning ripped out unique columns, and the liability story at Oak Ridge taught politicians to never say, restart. We sit in the single point of failure era, when one region's plants held most high purity capacity, and the battery boom hid the isotope problem in plain sight. Then we climb inside the hull and feel how pH, boron, and dance on isotope fractions you can barely weigh. Along the way, we follow the paper cuts. Export codes tweaked, test queues that bump isotope assays behind commercial jobs, contracts that reward shipments by weight not purity, and insurance riders that quietly drop isotopic guarantees. None of it illegal, all of it consequential. We'll watch a QA chemist sign a temporary deviation to keep a patrol on schedule and a procurement officer better deployment on a blend that looked fine until it didn't. Finally, we'll ask the only question that matters on a bad night at sea. When the margin shrinks under a gram, do you press or do you surface? The answer shaped a memo that changed policy, and it started with lithium nobody saw until the alarms sounded. The bomb's quiet ingredient. To understand the leash on that, Captain, you have to walk into a room that hummed before dawn and smelled like caustic and metal. Oak Ridge, mid-Cold War. The problem on the chalkboard was simple to write and brutal to solve. Separate lithium-7 from lithium-6 at industrial scale. Physics said their chemistry would be nearly identical. Policy said failure wasn't an option. Get this, they didn't use centrifuges. They used mercury. COLEX, the mercury-based chemical exchange process, moved lithium back and forth between an organic phase and an aqueous phase, exploiting a tiny isotope preference that only shows up after thousands of shuttles. Two columns stood like steel organ pipes. In one, lithium amalgam formed with mercury. In the other, caustic liquor stripped it back. The cascade sang when it was tuned. When it wasn't, it spat scale, foam, and lies. Meanwhile, down at Savannah River, a parallel craft took shape. Caustic soda exchange variants, tweaks to phase contactors, and the kind of operator law you never find in manuals. A chemist would run his thumb across a sight glass, feel the film, and know the mercury carryover was starting. He'd kill the flow, crack a valve, and watch a silver thread worm its way along the floor like a living thing. You kept a bucket ready, and your boots tied tight. Stakes weren't abstract. Weapons designers needed tritium for the stockpile, but they needed control more than volume. Lithium-6 was the tritium workhorse when irradiated in reactors. Lithium-7 was the safety margin, the isotope that didn't soak up neutrons and didn't throw tritium where you didn't want it. In that world, contamination cut both ways. Too much Li-6 in the wrong stream, and a reactor's neutron economy sagged. Too much Li-7 in a target, and tritium yield fell. The cascades had to split the atom's twins with a razor, day after day. Here, that's where the irony seeds itself. Those plants were built for bomb physics, but their side stream, the high-purity Li-7, became valuable to a peacetime machine no one had fully designed yet. Fleets of pressurized water reactors. The Navy learned quickly. If you make lithium hydroxide from Li-7, you get your pH control without feeding neutrons to Li-6. The purity bars written for weapons crept onto coolant spec sheets. A standard born in fear became routine. Inside the plants, routine meant improvisation. An operator joked the best tool in the building was a flattened spoon. Mercury would plate onto a gasket. Someone would pry it off and drop it into a jar labeled, in thick marker, savings. Night shifts turned into a choreography of wiping films, swapping resin beds, and tapping manometers that stuck at the worst possible moment. One Savannah River chemist, a man with coffee-black hands, spent so many weekends scraping carbonate scale off a pilot cell that he named the scraper Sunday. He'd tell apprentices, if your instrument starts to lie, it's never the instrument. It's always the chemistry. What nobody said out loud, but everybody felt, was the cost. Mercury left fingerprints everywhere, vapor in the rafters, beads in sumps, slicks in places managers swore were sealed. You didn't just run COLEX, you married it. And when the marriage soured, the cleanup took years. Oak Ridge learned that the hard way. The columns came down, but the liability didn't. Restart would become a dirty word long before Congress ever heard lithium-7 shortage. Meanwhile, the knowledge sat in notebooks that smelled like solvent. How you rate matched the organic and aqueous flows to keep the interface docile. How a 2-degree change in a contactor bay could flip the isotope preference and kill your cut. Which supplier's ion exchange resin shed fewer fines under caustic. None of it looked like national security on paper. All of it was. Then the wind shifted. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the weapons drawdown trimmed budgets. The Tritium mission changed. Planners asked why scarce dollars were tied up in old mercury columns when newer methods might do. COLEX felt like a relic with a legal tail. The calls were made, valves were chained. The Guild, because that's what it was, retired by attrition. A man who could hear a cascade go out of tune by the pitch of a pump took his hearing home. Here's the twist hidden in plain sight. The Navy didn't turn off with the columns. Submarine reactors still needed Li-7-based LiOH with purity that left no neutron money on the table. But the only people who knew how to hit those numbers at scale were walking out the gate. Commercial chemistry would step in with pooled production and broader specs, sure. Yet the habit of the Cold War, treat Li-7 like oxygen, always there, stuck around. What nobody knew at the time was how that habit would calcify into doctrine. Procurement officers would assume lithium meant lithium that behaves in a neutron field the way we expect. Utilities would assume their civil supply covered the margin. And somewhere in a filing cabinet, a memo would redefine stewardship of an isotope as nobody's job. Years later, a bland GAO title would call it out. But in these rooms, during these nights, the die was cast. Purity wasn't a number. It was a craft, welded to places, and people the fleet would one day wish it hadn't let go. The Vanishing plant switch off. When the cascades went quiet, it didn't happen with a speech. It happened with clipboards. A budget line narrowed, a maintenance deferral stretched. A pump that had screamed for years finally didn't get its bearing. The late 80s into the 90s were a season of tidy language, drawdown, consolidation, mission change. Inside Oak Ridge, the unspoken word was simpler: stop. COLEX had always carried two ledgers, tons of isotope on one side, pounds of mercury on the other. The day the lawyers started reading process flow diagrams like charge sheets, everyone knew which ledger would win. Inspectors in white suits staged photos near sumps. A manager pointed to a sheen and called it legacy. Legacy turned into liability. Liability turned into policy. Do not restart. The columns that once sounded like a pipe organ at peak shift were cut, craned, and pallet-trapped, as if someone might be tempted to bolt them back in the night. The know-how left faster than the hardware. The men and women who could read a contactor by the way the foam curled at a sight glass watched the keys change hands to decommissioning crews who measured success in locked gates, not clean cuts. A senior operator joked darkly that the only cascade left on site was the chain of signatures required to move a drum from one building to another. He signed his last work order and took the pen with him. Cost cutters didn't need to be villains. They just needed a spreadsheet. On paper, lithium was lithium. Battery markets and grease thickeners didn't care which isotope carried the charge. Civil reactors, hungry but forgiving, widened specs and learned to manage dose with other levers. Boron chemistry tweaks, filtration, fuel management. The narrow weapons-era purity that had sheltered naval reactors looked, to a generalist's eye, like overkill. The line item, Li-7 enrichment, got a footnote, non-core. Meanwhile, Oak Ridge bled time into cleanup. Mercury was patient. It lingered in seams, hid in pit bottoms, showed up where seals were sure. Each new detection fed new caution. The political story wrote itself. This is what the old way costs. The new way, if it existed, wasn't in anyone's portfolio. By the time talk of alternatives surfaced, membrane exchanges, crown ether dreams, the people who'd shepherded the last good drums out the gate were planting tomatoes. Across the Pacific, the silence wasn't universal. One country kept building columns. They didn't publish brochures. They didn't need to. If you wanted high-purity Li-7 at scale, you learned a new time zone and a new kind of patience. Contracts got longer. Questions about process details went unanswered. Shipments arrived with certificates that were complete enough to pay on and vague enough to worry over. A procurement officer would hold a sheet that said lithium content, 99.99%, and realize it could mean anything and nothing about Li-7. Stockpiles smoothed the edges for a while. Programs had stashed drums the way pilots stash fuel, because you never know. But drums age, packaging breathes, moisture does what moisture always does. Every annual inventory turned into a small confession. The pool is shrinking. Buyers signed long-term deals to cover the gap, Blind to the day a naval ramp would surge at the same moment a civil restock hit. The market didn't see submarines, it saw tonnage. And then, in 2013, a careful, bureaucratic voice said the quiet part aloud. The Government Accountability Office wrote that no federal entity had taken stewardship responsibility for lithium-7, that the United States had no domestic enrichment, and that the country leaned on foreign supply with limited visibility. The prose was mild. The implication was, if your coolant chemistry depends on a number nobody in your own system owns, your schedule belongs to someone else. Inside materials labs and QA rooms, the switch-off showed up as temporary deviations. A Shore lab couldn't clear a batch before a sale date because the mass spec queue was full of commercial work. Someone checked a box, used blend plan B, monitor tritium rates weekly, and promised to true up next cycle. Next cycle turned into the one after that. Blending worked until it didn't, and when it didn't, the neutron penalty didn't announce itself with a bang. It arrived as a slow theft of margin across months. What made the shutdown era dangerous wasn't a single bad actor. It was a stack of reasonable choices. Decommission a mercury-heavy process that scares regulators. Buy commodity lithium because the market's moving that way. Trust certificates that speak the language of chemistry, but not the dialect of isotope. Accept a delay because assay equipment falls under export controls you didn't write. None of it illegal, all of it cumulative. By the time a young engineer asked why the pH control budget counted grams the way a diver counts breaths, the answer traced back to a locked building and a retired guild. The Navy's need hadn't ended when the columns did. It had just gone quiet until the alarms. The single point of failure era. While Oak Ridge was tearing out columns, another skyline of stainless steel was going up an ocean away. No ribbon cuttings, no glossy photos, just capacity, quiet, growing, and increasingly alone at the top of the purity ladder. If you needed submarine-grade Li-7, you learned the names of 2 or 3 facilities in one region, and you hoped their calendars matched your patrol cycles. Hope is not a plan. It became the plan anyway. Here's where the market played its trick. In the 2000s, lithium meant batteries. Everyone talked about tonnage and carbonate versus hydroxide, not isotopes. Commodity charts rose like ski slopes. That heat threw a pleasant fog over a simple fact. The grams that matter to reactors aren't the grams that fill cathodes. Buyers walked into negotiations with price curves and delivery windows, then discovered a sentence that ate the meeting. What's your Li-7 assay? The answer arrived as a smile and a certificate. Lithium content 99.99%, which, again, could mean everything or nothing you needed. A procurement officer for a naval depot, let's call him Harris, kept a folder labeled questions nobody likes. At the top, who actually runs the isotope cut on this batch? The trader on the phone would say, our partners. Harris would ask for the partners processed. Silence stretched. Then, we meet purity. He'd run his finger along the spec sheet, down to the line that mattered. Li-7 greater or equal to 99.9%. And no, the only way to find out was to wait for a lab slot back home. Ships don't sail on we'll see. Meanwhile, GAO's 2013 report sat on desks like a smoke alarm you couldn't unplug. It said the quiet parts. The US had 0 domestic Li-7 production, no federal steward, and limited visibility into foreign supply. It didn't name the plants abroad or accuse anyone of bad faith. It didn't have to. Dependence is dependence whether the partner smiles or frowns. Planners clipped the executive summary and slid it into briefings. It changed little. The single point of failure stayed single. Consolidation made the slope steeper. 2 mid-sized producers merged. A third pivoted to battery-grade volumes with wider isotope tolerances because that's where the margins lived. Isotope separation is expensive to run and finicky to certify. If your biggest customers don't pay for nearly pure Li-7, why carry the burden? Civil utilities could adjust to drift with boron and fuel management. The silent service couldn't. But the silent service also didn't publish spot bids with theater-level urgency. It bought in the shadows and prayed the shadows would deliver. Shipments started landing with a pattern Harris could feel before he could prove. It Lots that met every chemical spec, except the one the neutron field cares about. Certificates used ranges, not absolutes. I say typical, 99, 599, 9%. Typical is a comfort word until it is. He'd phone the Shore lab to jump the queue. The lab chief would sigh. The TIMS was tied up on a commercial contract with penalties. He could slide Harris in at 20 tomorrow. If the pallets cleared, customs tonight. And customs had questions. Harmonized codes for lithium compounds didn't care about isotopes either. A freight forwarder would pick the tariff class that shaved days, not the one that preserved traceability. A drum that started its life as high-purity Li-7 hydroxide, nuclear grade, might arrive as lithium hydroxide monohydrate, tech. You could fix paperwork. You couldn't fix the neutron penalty inside a miscut lot. On boats, engineers started seeing chemistry that didn't read like the last decade. pH nudged right on plan, but dose monitors told a different story. Tritium readings drifted higher than the model predicted for the burnup. Not a spike, no alarm to hang a memo on, just a creep that ate margin. An XO wrote in his night orders, "Adjust Lee early, watch the trend." Adjusting early became routine. Routine became assumption. Assumption became risk. Battery boom masked the shortage in an almost elegant way. Corporate decks bragged about new lithium sources coming online, brine pools, hard rock, DLE miracles. Anchors on finance shows said lithium glut, with a question mark shaped like a smirk. In that noise, a sentence tried to raise its hand. Not all lithium is the lithium you need. The sentence never made air. Inside program offices, it did. Harris put it on the first slide. He still signed for blends when the lab was late. Remediation sounded smart in rooms far from seawater. Take a borderline lot, blend it with something purer, land just over the line. On paper, math wins. In reality, every blend steals certainty. Each intermediate drum becomes a new entity with a history you can't fully audit. The Navy's 1 gram margin, shorthand for the sliver of isotopic slack submerged reactors can tolerate, shrinks in practice because you've turned one unknown into 3. Information asymmetry finished the trap. The region holding most high-purity capacity knew who depended on them and when. They didn't need to flex. A missed quarters maintenance at a key column rippled into doubled lead times on another continent. Prices didn't explode. They oozed up just enough to make alternatives look rational. Alternatives took years. Patrols took weeks. Harris added a line to questions nobody likes. What happens if a single maintenance outage abroad overlaps a refit here? The answer lived in schedules, not statements. Quiet derates, adjusted patrol boxes, a memo about readiness phrased as routine maintenance. A captain at sea feeling the leash and choosing to surface, because a gram on a sheet isn't a gram in the core until the assay says so. Single point of failure isn't just a diagram. It's a feeling that starts in procurement and ends on the con. Inside the with alarms you can't argue saves reactors. Open the watertight door and it's hot, close and humming. Primary loop on the board, boron numbers scribbled in grease pencil, and a small white card with 2 figures circled, 7.2 and 7.4. Those aren't decorations. That's the pH window, corrected to what 300 degrees Celsius does to water's chemistry. Live inside it, and the metals keep their temper. Drift outside, and the plant starts writing IOUs you'll pay in dose, cracks, and downtime. Li-7 is the quiet hand on that dial. You dissolve it as lithium hydroxide, and it buffers the coolant against the acids born when radiolyses chews on water and when corrosion throws its tantrums. At room temperature, neutral is pH 7. At reactor temperature, neutral slides lower, and the right 7 on a handheld meter isn't the right 7 in the core. That's why the card S there. It's memory, not math. Now the part the periodic table doesn't warn you about. Natural lithium brings 2 characters to the party. Li-7, which barely notices neutrons, and Li-6, which loves them. When Li-6 grabs a neutron, it splits. Alpha particle here, tritium there. You don't feel that reaction like a kick. You feel it as a slow, relentless drift. Tritium builds where you'd rather it didn't. Helium finds its way into microstructures and pushes on grain boundaries. And the neutron that could have done useful work goes missing. Parasitic absorption is a polite phrase for a real cost. In a submarine reactor, margin lives in small places. Boron already soaks up neutrons to shape reactivity across the cycle. Fuel sees a planned burn-up curve. Control rods dance their careful dance. None of that expects a creeping thief in the coolant. So the spec pushes Li-7 purity hard. Think 99.9% and up, so that every gram you add to hold pH doesn't rent space to Li-6 habits. Miss that, even by the paperclip's worth that crews joke about, and you're paying interest on debt you didn't mean to take. Watch how it shows up. The EOOW calls for a small LiOH addition after a power change, routine. You watch the calculated pH track slide back into the box. Good. But an hour later, the tritium monitor ticks a little higher than your mental model says it should. Not an alarm, not yet. Just enough to earn a look. You log it, you watch it, and you tell yourself the assay will clear the lot tomorrow, if the lab can squeeze you in. Here's the harder story hiding under the chart tape. pH isn't just a corrosion guardrail. It decides which oxides form, where they form, and how stable they are. Nickel alloys in steam generators, stainless in piping, fuel cladding, each has a comfort zone. Stay buffered and the crud that does form tends to be tight, adherent, predictable. Drift and you get flake, spall, transport, spall heads to hot places. It rides the flow into the core, plates out where flux is highest, and starts shadowing neutrons. Now you've got a two-front war. Chemistry is tilting materials, and transporting crud is tilting physics. Engineers have tricks. Zinc injection can tweak oxide structure. Hydrogen control can manage radiolysis products. You can tune boron curves and manipulate letdown cleanup. But all those moves assume the foundation buffer, LiOH from Li-7, isn't sneaking in an extra neutron handbrake and a tritium tap. If it is, your fixes fight each other. Solve pH and raise dose. Lower dose and invite stress corrosion somewhere else. On a pier with time and lab slips, you can sort cause from effect. At depth on patrol, you can't. Get this, hydrogen pickup isn't just a word on a slide. Cladding sees hydrogen as a guest that overstays. Too much, and it changes how the metal deforms under stress. Tritium makes monitoring jumpy not because it's catastrophic, but because it turns your confidence into a question. Confidence runs a boat. If the EOOW believes the models, he'll stretch a little to protect the mission. If the models keep losing to the meters, he'll tighten. But there was one problem, the captain says in a debrief, keeping his voice flat so it doesn't sound like anger. We didn't know the number that mattered when we sailed. Sure, labs aren't villains, they're bottlenecks. True isotope assays, TIMS, MC-ICP-MS, aren't finger-stick tests. Their precision work with cues, calibrations, and lately, export control paperwork on replacement parts. A naval drum gets in line behind a commercial run with penalties. The calendar makes chemistry a gamble. Assay delays twist procedures. You write a temporary deviation that lets you blend. You promise to keep pH in the slot and watch tritium like a hawk. You insert extra samples into a schedule already tight with maintenance. It feels like diligence. It is diligence. It's also turning certainty into statistics. Each blend is a new roll of the dice on an isotope fraction you can't measure at sea. Meanwhile, the XO is thinking ahead of the plant. What does a creeping neutron penalty mean for Rodworth later in the patrol? What does a slightly higher dose rate mean for watch rotations and cumulative totals? Do we bank power early to protect materials margins? Or do we hold the line and spend chemistry to save schedule? None of these questions should hinge on whether a certificate used typical, where it should have said measured. Here's the part that keeps chiefs awake. A submarine reactor runs fine until it doesn't. The alarms you heard in the cold open weren't theatrics. If pH control slips while tritium creep says your Li-6 fraction is higher than planned, you start stacking small conservatisms. One day it's a quiet derate to give crud a chance to settle. Another day it's a surprise scram, because a set point you never used to nudge is now living on a hair trigger. That's not fear. That's a system telling you it wants the purity it was designed around. So yes, this is chemistry. It's also command. The smallest speck on a drum decides whether captain writes press or surface. And on boats where minutes matter, that gram isn't pedantry. It's the difference between riding the numbers and trusting them. The paper cuts that bleed a fleet. Walk into the QA office and you'll see it. A stack of certificates of analysis, each one neat, precise, and just slippery enough to miss the point. The top line reads, lithium hydroxide monohydrate, 99.99%. Good. The line you need 2 pages down says, LITHIUM-7 assay, typical 99, 599, 9%. Typical is a lullaby. Boats don't sail on lullabies. Here's where bureaucratic gravity does its work. A vendor splits a large production lot into smaller shipments to match delivery windows. Each daughter lot inherits the mother's certificate, but the isotope fraction shifts when moisture content drifts or when a drum gets topped off from a neighboring tote to standardize weights. Nobody lied. Nobody checked either. The paper stays clean. The chemistry doesn't. Then there's the harmonized code trick. A freight forwarder flips the HS code to shave a tariff point or bypass a slower inspection lane. On the dock, a drum that left port as nuclear-grade Li-7 hydroxide shows up as industrial lithium hydroxide, tech. You fix the customs entry, sure. What you can't fix is the broken chain of custody on the isotope assay. The sample jar that proved the batch was on spec is now divorced from the drum in your hand by a keystroke. Assays aren't instant. True isotope ratios need TIMS or MC-IPMS, machines that live behind locked doors, with calibration logs that read like pilot checklists. Those labs book weeks out, and they carry commercial penalties for delays. A naval rush job slides into a queue behind a pharmaceutical run that has a clause with zeros you don't compete with. So the shore chemist writes a temporary deviation. Use blend plan, behold pH tight. Watch Tritium daily. Promise to true up when the numbers land. That promise keeps the patrol on schedule. It also spends certainty like cash. The Government Accountability Office warned about this in 2013 without naming names. No federal entity has taken stewardship responsibility for assessing and managing risks to the lithium-7 supply. In plain language, nobody is on the hook to make sure what the Navy needs arrives, verified, when the Navy needs it. That gap breeds small behaviors that grow teeth. Vendors use assay ranges instead of absolutes. Buyers accept meets lithium content because contracts reward weight, not enrichment. Insurance riders get rewritten to exclude isotopic guarantees, quietly, on page 7, so a claim dies before it's born. Watch the blend room on a busy day. 2 borderline drums, 1 strong drum, a spreadsheet that sings assurance. The math works, but every blend creates a new entity with a history the certificate can't quite capture. You've taken 3 questions and fused them into one bigger question with nicer formatting. Meanwhile, the plant at sea sees a pH that looks right and a tritium drift that doesn't. The EOOW tightens procedures. The captain starts reading logs with a finger on the set points. Paper can slow a fleet in other ways too. Export controls tightened on precision assay gear. A replacement filament for a mass spec gets flagged for review because the vendor sits on the wrong side of a sanction tree. The part sits in a bonded warehouse while a patrol plan gets rewritten ashore. The result looks like maintenance in the weekly brief. It feels like a leash in the control room. Here's a micro story that never makes the press release. A QA chemist, Ray's, gets an email at 214. The lab slot opened. Bring the sample now. She drives with a cooler on the passenger seat because rules are rules, checks the chain of custody seals twice at red lights, and hands the vial across a threshold where the clock stops making sense. The analyst runs the instrument through midnight. The printout in the morning has a number with 2 decimals to the right of 99.9. Ray's knows what it means before anyone says it. Green light by a hair. She signs. She also circles the hair and sends a note. Stop accepting typical. Ask for measured. Meanwhile, a consortium shows up with a smile and a white paper on harmonized tolerances. The pitch sounds reasonable. Align military specs with broader industry ranges, reduce friction, boost availability. The slide that doesn't get read aloud is the cost column labeled Neutron Penalty Risk Transferred to Operator. Transferred as in you. The operator at sea with alarms. Certificates list lithium content, not Li-7 enrichment, because the template was written for grease plants and battery cathodes. Fixing that template means rewriting procurement habits, retraining inspectors, and telling suppliers that payment rides on a number they don't like to measure. That takes leverage. Leverage shows up when patrols get delayed and someone important asks why a superpower is waiting on a decimal. Blending hides sins. It also hides accountability. A mislabeled drum that slips through becomes part of 3 other drums by Friday. 6 months later, a reactor derates on a pattern that looks like weather until you line up the paperwork and see the family tree. By then, the trader is gone, the forwarder changed software, and the insurance rider points to clause 12. None of this looks like sabotage. That's the point. It's the sum of footnotes, Q slips, tariff flips, and certificates written for the wrong audience. It bleeds time, certainty, and margin. On a submarine, that's readiness. On a bad night in blue water, that's the difference between pressing and surfacing. The procedural leak, how it was done. If you're looking for a smoking gun, you won't find one. You'll find forms, and each form, standing alone, looks harmless. Together, they drain readiness like a pinhole in a ballast tank. Start at the start. Brine. Lithium comes out of salt flats and hard rock with a passport-stamped commodity. From there it moves to refiners who chase moisture, carbonate and metals, not isotopes. Enrichment sits a layer deeper, behind doors that don't host plant tour. That's where Li-7 is separated from Li-6, by chemical exchange columns, by vendor-guarded tweaks, by people who learn the hard way which contactor doesn't burp at shift change. Then packagers blend to target moisture, bag or drum the hydroxide, and hand it to logistics. Naval depots stand at the far end of this chain, squinting at certificates and hoping the words on the page map to neutrons in the core. Here's where plausible deniability earns its pension. A refiner sells to an isotopic partner, but that partner's contract allows subcontracting for surge capacity. The subcontractor meets every visible chemical spec, but their cut on Li-7 runs hot and cold because their columns were tuned for wider tolerances. The shipping label lists lithium hydroxide content, moisture, and trace metals, exactly what most customers demand. It does not list Li-7 enrichment because the template never asked for it. No law broken, no red flag tripped. The only place the number lives is in a separate assay report tied to a batch ID until the batch ID drifts. Watch a simple move break that tie. On a Friday rush, a warehouseman tops off a drum to hit a uniform net weight because the contract pays per drum. He pulls from a neighbor tote with the same product code. The internal lot number updates in the enterprise system. The paper cert doesn't. It's not malice. It's end-of-week muscle memory. By Monday, the blended drum carries a mother certificate for a daughter mixture. The Li-7 fraction is now an average of unknowns, and the family tree just lost a branch. Now drop the freight forwarder into the story. A customer service rep picks the harmonized tariff code that clears customs fastest. The code treats lithium salts as one category. Isotopes aren't part of the schedule. On arrival, the Naval Depot's intake clerk sees a mismatch between the purchase order's nuclear grade note and the bill of lading's technical grade. He fixes the entry, but the change severs the digital link to the offshore lab that ran the isotope assay. The lab's PDF sits in an inbox attached to an old reference number. The drum now exists as a legal fact without the scientific fact that mattered. Insurance used to backstop this. Then underwriters got smart. Policies started carving out isotopic composition guarantees from coverage, quietly, on the third page of riders written in comfortable fonts. If a batch tests off spec for Li-7, the claim stalls. The supplier points to the contract's definition of quality. The contract points to the certificate's typical range. The insurer points to the rider. Everyone points somewhere. The drum sits. Meanwhile, assay capacity is thin. Precision isotope ratios need TIMS or MCIMS with clean rooms, tuned standards, and parts that don't ship quickly when export controls get twitchy. A filament order lands on a list that requires license review because a component vendor changed domicile last quarter. The mass spec goes dark for want of a wire the thickness of a hair. The naval queue backs up. A patrol window narrows. Someone drafts a temporary deviation to blend two borderline drums into a pass. It keeps the schedule. It also spreads the uncertainty like paint. Here's a micro story that shows how fast identity can fracture. A freight forwarder, new to the account, sees lithium hydroxide monohydrate and switches the HS code to the one his software flags as low risk. He's shaving 2 days and a fee for his client. He doesn't know the receiving command treats that code as a red light for isotope traceability. The shipment gets routed through a different inland port. The depot's intake SOP for nuclear-grade lots never triggers. By the time anyone notices, the sample chain is broken. The assay vial that left the plant and the drum that hit the pier can't be proven siblings. What nobody knew at the time, insurers weren't the only ones rewriting fine print. Some suppliers started sliding "no isotopic warranty implied" into back pages of master service agreements. It read like boilerplate until a claim hit. Then it read like a wall. And over all of it hangs the shadow of domestic restart politics. Legacy, COLEX's mercury footprint turned "let's build columns here" into a hearing with photos no senator wants near a re-election ad. Even if new, mercury-free methods promise cleaner cuts, the ghost of Oak Ridge Slow's signatures. That political drag becomes market leverage abroad. If you can't restart at home and you can't verify fast, you accept what you're given. Blends, ranges, typicals, and you write procedures to survive your own paperwork. Nobody sabotaged a valve. Nobody tampered with an alarm. They didn't need to. The leak runs through procurement fields, insurance riders, tariff codes, and lab queues. It looks like administration. It behaves like a choke. And when geopolitics leans on sanctions and export controls, the narrow parts snap first, not where the cameras are, but where the filaments and certificates live. Sanctions, tariffs, and the boomerang. While the procedural leak spread through forms and freight codes, geopolitics walked in and kicked the legs out from under the table. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, tools meant to squeeze rivals, started squeezing the narrowest part of our own line first. GAO's 2013 warning sits in the background like a metronome. Zero domestic LI-7 production, no federal steward, dependence on foreign supply with thin visibility. Add friction to that system, and the weak links fail where you live. Here's how it felt on the ground. A routine order for ion exchange membranes, the kind that live inside isotope columns, hit a new tariff classification. The vendor shrugged. "We can still ship, but lead times just doubled." A follow-up note added a sting. "We're prioritizing our largest customers." Translation: battery plants with tonnage needs, not isotope lines with a boutique spec. At the same time, a small company that made specialty resins for lithium cleanup got caught in a sanctions splash because its parent had a joint venture in the wrong postal code. No one targeted LI-7. LI-7 got hit anyway. Export controls bit where you least expect them. Precision assay equipment, TIMS filaments, MC-IMS cones, moved onto lists that require end-use checks. Perfectly reasonable on paper. In practice, a Naval lab's reorder bounced between desks for weeks because a subcomponent supplier had shifted ownership to a foreign fund the year before. The instruments sat idle. Shore chemists shuffled samples and rewrote test plans by headlamp glow. A patrol window crept closer. Somebody suggested borrowing time at an allied lab. Good idea, until customs decided the sample vials themselves needed a declaration dance. Resin prices went up. Shipping premiums went up. A critical valve for a brine pre-treatment skid got flagged under blanket advanced manufacturing review because it used a new ceramic seat. The supplier swore it was dual use. The form didn't have a box for swearing. Weeks bled away. Program managers started drawing arrows on whiteboards from policy objective to unintended bottleneck. The arrows all ended at the same place: readiness. Utilities felt it too. A negotiator at an allied nuclear plant sat across from a defense liaison and shuffled a single sheet of paper she didn't want to hand over. It was a refueling schedule. "If we slide zinc injections and stretch a cleanup interval, we can free this much LI-7-based LiOH for 2 quarters, she said. "But we'll eat dose upticks and a tighter corrosion watch." She wasn't bargaining, she was triaging. Grid reliability on one side, submarine patrols on the other. She signed a letter of intent and didn't sleep that night. Lead times quietly doubled. Naval programs, staring at peer calendars, began cannibalizing civil stockpiles through back-channel agreements. The optics had to look like routine interagency coordination. The reality was a shell game. A utility delayed a pH adjustment plan and rewrote its ALARA notes. The Navy got drums with the right to say, this time. Everyone paid in inspection hours and political capital. Meanwhile, the Gear export controls created a second-order problem nobody budgeted for. Spare parts pipelines became single-threaded. A shipment of certified standards, a tiny box that teaches your instrument what 99.95% actually means, got stuck because the carrier changed their list of secure lanes. The lab chief called the depot. We can run relative numbers, but without fresh standards, I won't certify absolute LI-7 for deployment. The room went quiet. Relative confidence doesn't launch boats. In a conference room with coffee gone cold, a classified memo slid across a table. Proposal: an emergency purity holiday for deployments temporarily relax the greater or equal to 99.9% LI-7 spec if pH control and dose remain within guardrails. The arguments were familiar. Missions don't wait. Models can bound the neutron penalty. We can monitor tritium daily. The counter-arguments were older. Metallurgy doesn't negotiate. Tritium permeation isn't linear with comfort. A paper holiday on physics becomes a bill you pay in embrittlement, crud transport, and inspection debt. One captain put it in plain words. You can waive a signature. You can't waive a cross-section. He wasn't being pious. He was thinking about a fatigue-prone weld near a safe end that didn't need an extra nudge from hydrogen pickup this cycle. He was thinking about rod worth margins that look fine on slide 3 and tight on day 72. Trade friction also sharpened the asymmetry abroad. The region holding most high purity capacity watched us fumble and adjusted knobs we couldn't see. A maintenance slip at one plant coincided, unhelpfully, with a spike in global shipping costs. Contract clauses invoked force majeure with a smile. Deliveries slid right. Prices edged up, not enough to trigger headlines, just enough to make bad options look bearable. From the deck plates, none of this wore a villain's face. It wore stamps, emails, and coy phone calls about regulatory updates. It looked like good intentions hardened into controls that didn't know what they were controlling. And every control, nudged without a system steward, pushed LI-7 from scarce to precarious. The Purity Holiday memo didn't die. It went into a folder titled Contingencies, a word that tastes safe until you live it. In metallurgy shops, engineers circled it with red pens and notes. Cost here, crack there, dose everywhere. They weren't being precious. They were counting the Boomerang's arc. What started as policy to signal strength ended up signaling something else, to our own crews. If the smallest speck on a drum can be traded for a schedule, what else bends? That question hangs. Metallurgy fights louder than any alarm. Metallurgists hate holidays on physics. They don't write memos about it, they show you cross-sections. In a windowless lab, a tech lowers a polished coupon under a microscope. The image blooms, oxide layers, tiny voids, a hint of hydrides glinting like frost. That's what your Purity Holiday buys, the engineer says, not unkind. Debt, the room nods. Time to pay it down with craft. First tool on the bench. Change the dance, not the partner. If LI-7-based LIOH is the buffer you trust, you lean on techniques that make every gram do more work. They push zinc injection, not to swap out lithium, but to tailor the oxide films on nickel alloys. Zinc sits in the crystal lattice where impurities like to start trouble, nudging grain boundaries towards stability. With cleaner LI-7, zinc turns flaky crud into tighter magnetite, less likely to travel, less likely to shadow neutrons. With off-spec lithium, zinc helps, but you feel the ceiling fast. Next, they revisit the pH curve itself. Operators had flown a conservative corridor, 2 to 7.4 at temperature, because it balanced corrosion and crud. Metallurgists propose a micro shift, not a swerve. Hold closer to the top of the band during high flux periods, then ease back to mid-band when power changes risk spalling. That buys margin where dose climbs, but it narrows the window for error. You need assay certainty to play that tight. If the Li-6 fraction in your buffer is unknowable, you don't sharpen razors, you put them away. They also turn to hydrogen. Radiolysis makes it, chemistry controls it. By managing dissolved hydrogen, you can starve corrosive radicals and tune how oxides grow. Too little and you invite acidic mischief. Too much and you embrittle. With trustworthy Li-7, hydrogen control is a scalpel. With a moving isotope target, it's a butter knife. So they write a conditional plan. Hydrogen adjustments unlock only after measured Li-7 arrives, not typical. Here, SWF field craft meets theory. A diver suits up at a yard and drops under a hull to check safe ends. The fat transitions where piping meets vessel nozzles. He expects a dull, even grey. He sees patchwork and flake near a weld toe. He radios up. Oxide, spalling. Take pictures. In the briefing, the metallurgist doesn't panic. He traces the pattern to a period of aggressive pH correction during a week when assay was late. We asked the buffer to sprint before we knew its shoes fit, he says. The fix isn't heroics. It's discipline. On boat, pH holds steady unless the assay in hand says sprint. Procurement feels the shift too. Contracts used to buy lithium compounds by chemistry and water content. Metallurgy pushes a clause that flips payment triggers. No receipt without an isotope number, no blending without pre-approved trees, no typical language anywhere. Vendors complain. One tries a price dump to keep old terms. A young buyer remembers the con and says no. Somebody's patrol just got saved by a sentence in legalese. Meanwhile, inside the plant, they fight crud with geometry. Flow tweaks, baffle inspections, and targeted cleanup flows in letdown lines all aim to starve hotspots of loose oxides. They trial a more aggressive resin in cleanup demineralizers, one that chews on specific corrosion products, provided it doesn't load metals back into the loop. These aren't headline grabs. They're small levers that turn a drifting trend flat. Engineers also revisit weld margins. Fatigue lives at details. The nick in a toe, the micro pit that grows under cyclic stress. Any policy that invites extra hydrogen into cladding or bumps dose in inspection zones steals life from those details. So they stringently tie operational derates to materials debt, not schedules. If tritium drifts for reasons tied to Li-6 contamination, power derates aren't optional. They're rent for the debt you just took. Crews don't like it. They respect it when you show them the fracture face. Here's a micro story. A maintenance team opens a steam generator manway on a legacy boat. The plan calls for routine visual, light cleanup, reseal. 10 minutes in, a mechanic's brush lifts a thin scab of oxide that flakes too easily. He freezes, calls the metallurgist over. Under a loop, the layer looks wrong, friable, poorly adherent. They halt. A dye-penetrant test shows no cracking yet, but the film's telling a story. Recent pH swings painted over a week of off-spec buffer. The schedule slips. Nobody apologizes. The post-job notes read, adjust pH slower post-assay, increase zinc hold, inspect safe ends next window. A month later, the same area shows tighter oxide and stable readings. The lesson cost days. It saved months. Not every experiment wins. They trial mixed alkali control in a test loop, tiny sodium additions layered under lithium to see if a broader buffering base helps when Li-7 is thin. On paper, it softens transients. In practice, trace sodium breeds a different crud behavior and complicates cleanup. The team kills it fast. That's success too, ending a path before it writes bills you'll pay in the core. By now, the purity holiday memo looks naive. Metallurgy has translated it into failure modes. Hydrides nibbling at ductility, crud storms shadowing bundles, weld toes losing kindness. They've also mapped the escape routes. Zinc where it works, tighter pH ballet only with certified Li-7, conservative hydrogen where assay drifts, and hard stops on blending games. The plan reads dull. That's the point. Dull plants don't scram for surprises. And buried in all the charts is the quiet decision that turns craft into policy. No patrol starts on borrowed purity. If the number isn't measured, the plant doesn't play hero. You wait, you fix your oxide, You trust your buffer, and you treat grams like orders. Chemistry's not a suggestion. It's the hull's heartbeat. Rebuilding an isotope guild. The decision came down like a sentence. Stop renting purity. Build it, not a press release. A project code name, a locked floor, and a budget line thin enough to keep cameras away. First order of business wasn't steel or solvents. It was people. Someone opened a phone tree that hadn't rung in years and asked a question that felt like trespass. Do you still remember how to make LI-7 sing? The first to walk back in carried a pocket notebook older than his badge. He'd cut his teeth at Savannah River and talked about columns like old friends who sulked in winter, which contact allied when the phase interface got jumpy. He looked at the young crew, all degrees and clean hands, and said, "We're not recreating a plant. We're recreating a habit." They wrote it on the whiteboard and circled it twice. Mercury was out. That ghost shut doors long ago. The team pivoted to cleaner cuts, multi-stage chemical exchange without amalgam, membrane-assisted separations, tightly controlled countercurrent contactors with organic aqueous pairs tuned for isotope preference measured in the third decimal. The physics is stingy. The craft matters. A 2-degree swing and the fractionation factor moves from worth it to waste. A resin with the wrong cross-link density sheds fines that carry lithium past samplers and wrecks mass balances. You don't fix that with a memo. You fix it with eyes on sight glasses and hands on valves. Qualification took longer than anyone liked. Regulators didn't care about inspiration. They cared about cradle-to-reactor traceability. Every drum had to come with a genealogy, parent columns, flow histories, assay snapshots linked by tamper-evident seals and digital signatures that would hold up when a congressional staffer asked, "Who signed this?" The mass spec lab became the project's heart. They ran TIMS until filaments glowed dull and swapped cones on MC-MS rigs at 3 a.m., building a library of standards tied to NIST references so no one could argue the decimals. Recruiting retirees turned into a quiet miracle. A grey-haired tech named Whitaker brought a folded note from his wallet, a hand-calculated correction from a day the interface misbehaved in 1978. He'd written it down because the instrument voucher was late and they had to trust a manometer and a gut. The note looked like chicken scratch. It solved a purity riddle that had been nibbling their yield for months, a temperature-dependent phase density quirk that shifted the effective contact area between stages. The young lead taped a copy above the control screen. "Whitaker's Law," she said. The plant breathed easier. Here's where it got human. The first time they walked a small cascade, the room went quiet like a chapel. Organic to aqueous, aqueous to organic, 100 stainless throats whispering. A junior operator, hands steady but new to the music, nudged a valve too far. The interface rose like a tide and threatened to burp. Whitaker didn't shout. He touched the man's elbow and said, "Feel the pump. That pitch means you're 1 turn past kind." 1/4 turn back, the hum settled. You can't learn that from a PDF. Qualifying membranes was a knife fight with patience. Vendors promised pore-sized distributions and chemical compatibilities that sang on slides. In the loop, a few bled plasticizer at temperature, poisoning a downstream assay. Others warped under caustic and pinched flow. The team ran bake-offs in parallel, spiking feeds with tracers, watching rejection rates versus throughput like day traders watch screens. When a candidate held cut and capacity for a month without shedding fines, they didn't celebrate. They tried to break it. Success wasn't a day. It was a histogram that stayed boring. Regulators asked for cradle-to-reactor. The program gave them more. They built a digital chain of custody that put every drum on a ledger from raw brine through the last bolt on a pallet. Each batch got a cryptographic seal linked to lab assays. Any split or blend had to be pre-approved in a decision tree that killed creative paperwork. Truck tamper locks talked to a server. A broken seal pinged phones. Old hands smirked. Trust but verify had grown barcodes. Then came the first drum that mattered, not pilot purity. Submarine grade measured no blend. They didn't pop champagne. They rolled it into a test bay and dissolved a sample, ran the assay twice, and then sent blind splits to an allied lab across a border. When three numbers matched inside their own tight little world, the lead signed with a pen that didn't shake. "Ship it," she said, then caught herself. "Qualify the shipper. Old habits die because new ones replace them." This was the moment everything changed, the memo would later say, and for once the sentence earned its keep. A captain on the other coast read the number in a pre-deployment brief and didn't ask for a contingency blend plan. The EOOW underlined the PH card and didn't pencil a caution about tritium creep. Small things, but submarines are built from small things. Success invited attention. A trader called with a too-good spot cargo. "Military-friendly terms," he said, a smile you could hear. The young buyer who'd said no to price dumps felt the tug and still said no. "Our spec buys purity. Your price buys questions." The call ended cool. A week later, a phishing campaign hit the assay lab. It looked like an equipment vendor update. It was. It traced it, patched holes, and changed how standards moved. Escrowed hashes, two-person integrity, air-gapped uploads burned to read-only media. Paranoia isn't theater when your decimals buy deterrence. The old gatekeepers noticed in quieter ways. A rival facility abroad quoted longer lead times and offered harmonized tolerance language. The program thanked them and didn't blink. Redundancy was the next line on the board. Second enrichment node across a different grid, third-party labs under MOU with military-only spec sheets, and an agreement with allies to pool orders for buffer stock that answered only to submarines. The guild wasn't a plaque on a wall. It was a set of reflexes, passed in rooms that smelled like caustic and coffee, wired into contracts, audits, and a plant's soundscape. When the second drum met spec without blending, a junior operator rang a small bell nobody had authorized. Whitaker laughed. "Now you're allowed to write it down," he said, and patted the notebook in his pocket like a relic. Counterpressure and counterintelligence. Success changed the tone of the phone calls. Prices softened in places that used to be granite. Emails arrived from vendors UD never met, offering assay standards at half the usual cost and double the availability. The subject lines looked helpful. The attachments carried teeth. When you start taking grams of leverage back, someone tests your grip. The first probe found the softest path, people who want to help. A junior tech at the assay lab got an email that looked like a firmware notice from a mass spec supplier. Logo right, sender close enough, timing perfect, maintenance weak. The link opened a portal that asked for the lab's calibration library. "Upload to pre-validate," it said. He paused, called it, and bought the program a day. Forensic teams traced the server to a relay chain that started in a country with columns we used to beg time from. The lesson wasn't paranoia. It was hygiene, escrowed standards, offline storage, two-person integrity for any change to isotope baselines. Then the honey trap offers started. A trader dangled a spot cargo of nuclear-grade Li-7 hydroxide with delivery inside of 30 days. The price undercut our qualified line by a third. The contract language was slick, payment upon preliminary chemical acceptance, with isotope results confirmed by typical range. Typical again, the lullaby word. The young buyer who'd held the line before asked for a measured number, lab and method named, sample pulled by our chain. The reply came back friendly and firm. "We can't disclose proprietary details." He closed the file. 2 days later, a whisper network lit up with claims that our program was anti-competitive. Right on cue, a niche outlet ran a piece about wasteful defense purchasing in specialty chemicals. No names, plenty of innuendo. Meanwhile, price games surfaced offshore. A familiar supplier suddenly flooded the market with borderline lots priced to move. Utilities hurt by earlier delays jumped, blending their way to comfort. Our phones rang with second-hand offers. "If you loosen the assay spec slightly, we can give you all you need." Slightly is another lullaby. Metallurgy had already translated it into cracks. The hit that rattled the room came at midnight. The QA lab's mass spec spit out an assay spike that defied physics, Li-7 at a purity you don't get outside of textbook slides. The analyst stared, reran, got the same lie. Someone had slipped a spoofed standard into the rack. The bottle label was perfect, the contents weren't. The tamper band looked intact until you put it under magnification. The cut had been micro-welded. It It was art. It pulled logs. Procurement pulled every standard in inventory. Security froze sample intake. By morning, they'd rebuilt the chain with seals that talked back, serialized caps that chirped when opened, double-bagged standards sealed in inert gas, and check vials whose only job was to call you a fool if you trusted the first read. Legal took heat too. Contract hunter traps showed up with military-friendly clauses that hid landmines, arbitration offshore, quality disputes capped at refund of price paid, no explicit isotopic warranty. If you signed, you married risk and waived leverage. Our council, now fluent in neutron economy, rewrote the playbook, measured LITHIUM-7 as a condition precedent to acceptance, lab method named and witnessed, chain of custody digital and physical, escrow data hashes lodged with a neutral. Vendors balked, some walked. The ones who stayed looked us in the eye. Counterpressure wasn't just digital or legal. It walked through side doors. A mid-tier supplier pitched partnership to a subcontractor in our membrane stack, offering cash to accelerate upgrades, plus advisory insight into our plant's process if the partner would share integration data. The subcontractor called our lead and forwarded the deck. We brought them inside the tent, signed them to NDAs with teeth, and gave them a slice of the upside if they stayed exclusive. Money fights money. Trust fights the rest. Meanwhile, politics did what politics does. It searched for a headline. A committee hearing latched onto our per-drum cost. Why pay a premium, one member asked, when the market offers cheaper product? The program director answered without flinching. Because cheap lithium isn't the lithium we need. Our spec buys readiness, not powder. It wasn't a sound bite. It was a line in the sand. The hearing ended with homework. Deliver a resilience plan that didn't look like a blank check. So we layered in redundancy by design. Second enrichment node on a different grid. Third-party labs under MOUs with mirrored standards, and escrowed assay data anchored to external timestamps. We split procurement, routine buys through the qualified line, contingency buys pre-cleared with allied stockpiles tied to our spec, not theirs. We pushed tamper-evident chain of custody hard, RFID seals, shock loggers on pallets, geofenced routes that pinged if a truck stopped where it shouldn't. Paranoid, no, patient. The pressure didn't stop. Fishing tried new masks, prices dipped at convenient hours. A rumor circulated that our first node had quality issues. It fizzled when the next 4 drums cleared at numbers nobody could argue with. Attention drifted. That's the other quiet law of counterintelligence. Survive the first storm, and some storms choose easier targets. Resilience wasn't victory. It was continuity. We weren't aiming to win a market. We were aiming to keep a promise written in decimals to crews who don't get to pick their weather. Designing anti-fragile supply. While the first node held the line, the mandate shifted from survive to won't break when kicked. Anti-fragile isn't a slogan. It's a map with no single stop whose failure ruins your week. Start with dual enrichment nodes, true peers, not a main and a backup. Different grids, different waters, different suppliers for resins, membranes, and valves. If one plant sneezes, the other doesn't catch it. The cascades aren't clones either. Stage counts differ, contactor geometries aren't shared, and organic aqueous pairs aren't identical. That way, a process quirk or a targeted disruption can't poison both at once. It costs more to qualify parallel tech trees. It buys the kind of sleep crews earn. Then make certainty portable. Assay data moves to escrow as it's born, hashed, time-stamped, and mirrored offsite under 2 jurisdictions. The lab uploads a sign packet for every batch. Method, instrument ID, calibration references, raw spectra, processed ratios, and witness signatures. A neutral holds the same packet so no vendor, lab, or buyer can rewrite yesterday. When a drum arrives at a depot, the seal on the lid talks to the ledger. Open the lid, the world knows. Break the seal, the hash won't match. Paper can lie, ledgers argue back. Chain of custody goes from theater to tamper-evident practice. Drums wear serialized caps that chirp when cracked. Pallets carry shock and tilt, loggers that tattletale if a forklift kisses too hard or a pallet naps in the rain. GPS beacons geofence routes. A truck that stops at the wrong warehouse pings phones in 3 time zones. None of that stops a thief. It ruins their day by making the lie expensive. Blending flips from habit to last resort. Decision trees live in contracts now, blend only with pre-qualified parents, under witnessed sampling, with pre-planned target assays and confidence bands that clear metallurgical guardrails. Every blend spawns a new digital identity, never a paperwork orphan. If a drum can't stand alone at spec, it doesn't sail on mission. That sentence hurts schedules until it saves one. Procurement stops being one big door. It becomes lanes. Routine flow runs through contracted nodes with fixed assays, delivery windows, and penalties that bite both ways. Contingency flow pre-negotiates access to allied stock built to our spec, not theirs, held in depots that answer to a joint board with a simple rule: mission beats margin. Spot cargoes only enter through a quarantine loop, assayed twice, sealed twice, then dripped into civil buffers if fine, never into boats unless they sing the number. Information asymmetry used to be a weapon against us. We turn it by narrowing what matters and making it loud. Vendors get paid on measured Li-7, not lithium content. Typical leaves the dictionary. Lab methods sit in the contract by name, TIMS or MCIMS, traceable to standards we can touch. Insurance goes back on the hook. Isotopic composition as an insured attribute, with riders written in language lawyers can't sand down. Claims get adjudicated on data in escrow, not memos with adjectives. Allies get seats and jobs. We pool orders across navies that ride PWRs and share QA labs under MOUs with military-only spec sheets. A British analyst runs our split on Tuesday. Our lab runs theirs on Thursday. The numbers meet in escrow on Friday. When a plant in one country pauses for maintenance, a sister node across a border leans in. It's not charity, it's deterrence run as a co-op. On boats, anti-fragile looks like tools finally catching up. Portable isotope checks, still not lab grade, but good enough to flag a liar, join the kit. You pull a small sample, run a benchtop pre-screen that reads like a breathalyzer for Li-6 signals. If it squints wrong, you don't add. You call Shaw, and Shaw has the redundancy to answer, not apologize. The EOOW's card still reads 72744, but the confidence behind it stops living on a distant queue. Contracts grow teeth you can point at. Vendor rectification clauses don't refund invoices. They replace drums, pay for assays, and cover idle costs when a patrol slips because their certificate sang lullabies. The first time a supplier eats that bill, the market learns our spec isn't theater. Meanwhile, we stop hiding the right amount. Briefings telegraph resilience without painting bullseyes. Multiple qualified sources, not a plant at this address. Allied QA mirrors, not this lab has this cone. Enough light to deter games, not enough to script an attack. A young buyer, the same one who told the Hunnet trap no, writes a checklist for his team, ask for measured numbers, pay on decimals, quarantine spot cargoes, never trade time for typical. One day he gets a call from a captain he'll never meet. Your no kept us from a bad sail. He pins that to his monitor and calls it his compass. And somewhere off-screen, schedules change shapes. Patrol boxes stretch back to where planners wanted them. D-rates become choices, not reflexes. The fleet runs on a buffer that behaves because the market feeding it learned to fear sloppiness more than it loves volume. Anti-fragile isn't a bunker, it's a mesh. Cut one line the others carry. Kick one node, a sister stings. Try a price dump, the escrow decimals hold. You don't win strategic patience, you keep promises strategic signaling. Rebuilding purity didn't flip deterrence back on overnight. It bought us choices, and choices need time. Time is the rarest thing on a patrol schedule. So the plans split. Hold what matters, show enough to keep rivals honest, and never flash the whole. Operationally, that meant reshuffling boxes on a map most people never see. Older boats with tighter materials, margins took wider water, patrol areas with gentler thermal cycles, fewer abrupt depth changes, and sea states that don't demand constant throttle work. Not weakness, prudence. The payoff was quieter chemistry, smoother pH control, and less crud excited into motion. In parallel, newer boats with healthier margins shouldered the friskier routes. You don't publish that swap. You just do it. Air and sea paired up tighter too. Maritime patrol aircraft leaned into gaps with ISR runs that looked routine from the outside and targeted from inside the brief. Surface combatants shifted to cover choke points where a fast surface presence could signal, "We see you," without revealing which submarine wasn't there today. Joint exercises grew teeth in the press releases. Photos of carrier decks full and flight lines busy. The message rides on steel. The subtext rides on grams. Public comms walked a narrow rail. Maintenance, winds went out on official feeds, refueling milestones, inspection successes, crew of the quarter stories from yards where oxide looked right and weld toes were happy. None of it lied. All of it steered attention toward progress, away from the reason progress mattered. Rivals read those lines too. They saw activity, not the decimals behind it. That was the point. Inside control rooms, honesty cut a different path. A co on a legacy boat pulled his wardroom in and drew two curves on a whiteboard, one for power, one for chemistry confidence. "We hold here," he said, tapping the overlap, "until the assay says go." He wasn't grandstanding. He was buying morale with clarity. Crews don't fear caution. They fear confusion. When you tell them the why, they'll make the how work. Here's a micro moment that tells the truth of patience. Mid-patrol, the EOOW requests a small derate to give Crud a chance to settle after a week of minor pH nudges. The captain listens, glances at the mission clock and nods. 10% for 24, he says. Up top, an aircraft fills the picture a sub would have painted. The intel team gets what it needs. The plant gets a breath. Nobody cheers. Everyone sleeps a little better. Strategic signaling isn't only about shows of force. It's about what you don't flinch at. When a rival boat noses close to a boundary, a destroyer turns just enough to say, "We're not thin here," while a sub that could have answered doesn't need to. When chatter spikes about maintenance backlogs, an allied navy posts a photo of a joint QA lab swapping standards, boring to civilians, loud to anyone who speaks Isotope. The message threads through. We're knitting our buffers together. Don't count on a single scene. Policy filled in the scaffolding. A memo went out across programs. Readiness reporting would add a line for chemistry assured, red, amber, green, defined by measured LI-7 in hand. It wasn't punitive. It was a compass. Green boats stretched, amber boats held conservative profiles, red boats stayed tied until their numbers sang. The first time a green tag turned a would-be derate into a full power run during a tight window, the system earned trust it could spend later. We didn't stop taking calculated risks. We moved them. Instead of gambling on typical assays, we gambled on elegant cover, more air-sea handoffs, more allied overlap, more redundancy stirring under the surface of schedules. A rival probing for gaps found noise instead of silence. Noise wastes their time. Time buys our grams. There were temptations. A staffer floated the idea of hinting at the second enrichment node's capacity in a closed door with foreign press, a leak to spook price games. The program lead killed it. "We don't bluff with plants," she said. "We let drums arrive." Another proposal suggested parking a boat close to a hot spot to overcompensate for a quiet week elsewhere. The Admiral crossed it out. "We're not allowed to hide thin. We're steady to make thin irrelevant." Strategic patience isn't passive. It's disciplined inconvenience. Boats rotate through deeper maintenance to lock in oxide gains and rebaseline inspection intervals. Crews drill more on pH transients and tritium monitor interpretation so small wiggles don't read like cliffs. QA teams run weekend shifts to clear assays before sales. Everyone eats a little pain so nobody eats a lot. And then the tease we promised. The line crews started calling the 1 gram rule wasn't born in a memo. It was born in a room where metallurgy and neutron physics overlapped, and someone drew the thinnest safe slice between buffer and breeder. That slice became a habit. That habit became doctrine. We'll show you where it came from. Back to the boat where this started. The 1 gram moment, Payoff. Mid-Pacific night watch. The boat hums like a held breath. In maneuvering, the EOOW has the trend lines up, pH inside the 7, 2-7, 4 box, boron curve where it should be, tritium monitor doing a slow climb it shouldn't. Not a shout, just a creep. He taps the screen twice, then looks at the clipboard that holds a number they don't have yet. The measured LI-7 assay on the last drum added before sale. He calls the engineer forward. "We're holding, sir. Chemistry looks right. Dose doesn't." The engineer asks the question nobody wants to, because it's also the only one that matters. "How much margin?" The EOOW doesn't guess. He points at the slope. "If the assay clears at the top of spec, we're fine. If it's a hair under, we're spending rod worth early." Unknown to them, a shore chemist named Reyes is staring at a mass spec screen that won't light. A filament shipment got caught in a licensing loop. She cannibalized a spare and coaxed the TIMS to life. The first run spits noise. The second holds. She breathes once, pulls a blind split, and runs the third. You don't call a boat on one number, you call on 3. Back at depth, the captain walks in, calm on purpose. He listens to the engineer, then to the EOOW, then says what good captains say when the answer lives in decimals. "We wait for the lab." Waiting isn't passive. He orders a quiet derate, 5%, to flatten crud transport while they ride the clock. The navigator adjusts the line. The mission clock doesn't care. 20 minutes later, the first result lands at the depot. 99.88% LI-7, 200ths under the submarine hard line. Reyes doesn't send it. She reruns. 99.89. She calls the Allied lab to wake a favor. The third number will take an hour. She writes a note. Borderline. Recommend hold pending confirmation. She knows what those words mean in blue water. The engineer gets the call from shore without the number, just the tone. Not green yet. He looks at the captain. The captain looks at the board, then at the crew. He doesn't stage a speech. He asks one question. If the third number stays where the first two are, what's the cost? The engineer answers in steel and dose. We'll have to bank power for longer. Rod margins get skinny later. Tritium creep will push watch rotations. The captain nods once. Line up to surface on my order. We don't trade doctrine for minutes. He keys the 1MC. Engineering con. We are preparing to surface. This is deliberate. Deliberate lands heavier than caution. In sonar, a petty officer glances at a photo taped inside a locker and tightens his headset. In reactor controls, a junior watchstander swallows, then runs the surface checklist steady, not fast. Nobody likes it. Everybody understands it. Topside air hits like a slap. The world is suddenly big and loud. A destroyer, hours away on a routine route, shifts a patrol box just enough to make a new line look planned. Overhead, an aircraft leans into a track. The mission keeps moving around a hole nobody sees because the hole is a gram wide and underwater. Reyes gets the Allied lab split. 99.89. 3 numbers make a truth. She doesn't hedge, she calls. Off spec by a hair. Recommend stand down. The words travel faster than the boat can. In maneuvering, the engineer hears them, closes his eyes for a second, and then says, "Scram set points unchanged. We hold conservative." The captain writes a single line in the log, the one that will get photocopied into binders a year from now. No patrol starts on borrowed purity. Crew debrief runs quiet. The XO draws 2 curves on a whiteboard, the ones he drew weeks ago, and circles the overlap that didn't exist tonight. "We didn't lose this mission," he says. "We refuse to spend next month's plant to buy this hour." A sonar tech asks the question that matters to morale. "Sir, do we fix this?" The captain answers with the program's heartbeat. "We are fixing it. Drums are coming with numbers, not lullabies." In the aftermath, procurement kills, typical in 3 contracts. The labs get their filaments through a route that doesn't cross nerves. The next boat sails with a measured number stapled to a drum and a captain who doesn't need a contingency blend plan. The bruise becomes a policy. The policy becomes a habit. The habit saves a patrol you'll never hear about. 1 gram didn't shut down a fleet. It forced a choice. Mission now or margins forever. That night, a commander picked margins. The rival watching saw nothing but routine and moved a piece 2 squares. History won't footnote the decimal that bent that move. The crew will remember. They felt the leash, and they chose not to wear it. The Playbook, closing the loop. The first rule landed with no fanfare. Lock purity before you load. Pre-deployment isotope locks became a ritual as firm as weapons checks. Measured Li-7 in hand, a say method named chain of custody unbroken, or the drum never touches a deck. Not typical, not pending, measured. The depot's receiving bay changed too. Drums rolled under cameras, SEALs chirped their IDs to a ledger, and a sampler pulled witness vials on the spot. If one SEAL story didn't match the escrowed assay packet, the forklift turned the drum around. No captain would have to gamble on paperwork again. On-boat checks got sharper without pretending to be labs. A benchtop pre-screen rode with the kit, a quick isotopic sniff that can't certify but can catch a liar. The EOOW could now run a 10-minute flag on a fresh edition. If the read squinted wrong, the buffer waited for sure confirmation. That small gate kept crews from helpfully fixing pH swings with a mix that carried a neutron tact. Patience, locked to numbers, replaced hustle greased by hope. Vendor behavior changed because contracts learned new verbs. Rectification clauses stopped paying back invoices and started paying back time. Off-spec drums didn't just get refunded. Suppliers had to replace, fund emergency assays, and cover idle costs when patrol plans slipped. The first time a check went out with idle time credit, Reactor department. On the memo line, the market felt the teeth. Buyers stopped being supplicants. They became operators, holding a standard that reached into someone else's balance sheet. Blending moved from standard practice to rare, witnessed surgery. Decision trees got taped to blend room walls. Only pre-qualified parents, only with a say in hand, only with a planned target and a confidence band that Metallurgy had already blessed. Every blend spawned a new identity that couldn't hide behind a mother cert. If a drum couldn't sing on its own, it didn't board a boat. The habit cost a few schedules early. It bought confidence later. Confidence that let captains push power without a voice in the back of their heads, whispering about typical. Paper templates finally caught up with physics. Certificates added a line that should have been there all along. LI-7 enrichment, measured, method, lab, date, witness. Lithium content got demoted to a supporting fact, not the headliner. Insurance riders flipped too. Isotopic composition returned as a covered attribute, adjudicated on data escrowed out of reach from creative edits. Underwriters stopped playing shell games because the shells were transparent. Pre-deployment briefings added a new slide that sounded boring and landed like armor. It listed drums by serial, assay by decimal, seals by hash. The co saw in one glance the purity chain his plant would live on. No lullabies, no we think, just numbers users could trust. It changed behavior downstream. When pH drifted a hair after a hard maneuver, the EOOW didn't overcorrect. He knew the buffer's bones. He let the cleanup loop do its job, then nudged, not shoved. The plant felt steadier because the people did. Out in the market, the playbook got loud in the right places. Allied orders pooled into military-only lanes with mirrored QA labs. Our spec or no spec stopped being a patriotic bumper sticker and became a shared procurement sentence. A British lab ran our split on Tuesday. We ran theirs on Thursday. Results met in escrow Friday. Vendors learned there wasn't a soft door to whisper through in another flag. The number had to match in two places run by people who talk. Here's a micro story from the new normal. A QA chief at a depot, Keller, stands over a borderline drum. The assay packet reads 99.9 on the dot. The bench pre-screen squints, not red but not green. Old habit would have said blend it gently. New habit said wait. He kicks the drum into quarantine, calls the lab and shifts a load plan by 12 hours. The EOOW who'd written a hedge note on his pH card scratches it out and writes a simple word. Clear. The boat sails a day late. It runs a week steady at full power. In maneuvering, nobody thanks Keller by name. They don't need to. The plant hums without surprises, and that's the compliment. Discipline became culture, not checklist theater. Sampling cadence went from when we can to when we said we would, with spare capacity for spikes so labs don't collapse when patrols cluster. Training changed too. Watchstanders learned why 7.3 at temperature isn't a shrug but a promise, how Li-6 sneaks its cost in 3 slow moves, and when to call for patience instead of pouring powder. Crews saw fracture faces in briefings, not just cartoons. It's easier to say no to typical when you've seen a hydride fringe under a scope. And the lessons didn't stop at lithium. The playbook grew sections for boron-10, control rod poison that lives on the same knife edge of assay and availability. It added hafnium for reactor control blades and helium-3 for neutron detectors that keep watch in quiet rooms. Each got the same rules: measured before mission, escrowed data, tamper-evident custody, anti-blend bias, and contracts that move pain to the source of sloppiness. Gram-level choke points don't respect service boundaries. The habits that protect one number protect the rest. The last mile, the space between a qualified drum and a boat's intake, turned from a shrug into a route with guardrails, geofenced runs, seals that tattled if a pallet took a nap in the wrong zip code, shock logs that called a forklift's bad day what it was, cause for a recheck. Intake SOPs split civilian and submarine flows with different badges, different cages, and different consequences. A mislabeled drum could still exist in the world. It couldn't sneak into the hull's heartbeat. Closing the loop didn't make the story flashy. It made it dull in the way crews prize. Numbers arrived on time. PH lived in its narrow house. Tritium graphs stopped writing slow questions in the margins. Captains reached for press because their engineers didn't flinch. And every time a buyer said no to typical, every time a lab refused to certify without a fresh standard, every time a depot kicked a drum to quarantine over a chirp that didn't match a hash, the fleet's leash got shorter until it wasn't a leash anymore. It was a line, drawn, held, and lived. A single decimal on a quiet drum decided whether steel stayed kind, crews stayed confident, and patrols stayed invisible. When we stopped renting purity and started measuring it, readiness returned in the smallest, truest way, by habit. If you want the next hidden lever that decides missions, watch our breakdown of the boron-10 bottleneck, how one isotope throttles reactor startups. Subscribe for deeper dives into the materials wars shaping deterrence, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the unseen gears that move fleet.